Alex, 1917, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yes.
But you didn't stay there long. You went to Cape Town when you were very little.
Yes. The reason being that that Johannesburg is very high. It's about 3,500 to 4,000 feet above sea level, and it affected my father's breathing. And we were advised by a doctor to move to the coast, and that's when we moved from Johannesburg to Cape Town. At that stage, I was a baby still. I suppose I was approximately a year old, and we settled in a place called the Gardens in Cape Town. That was a small village in the Gardens, Cape Town, and that's where we stayed, and that's where my sister was born, in the Gardens, Cape Town.
What did your dad do for a living?
My dad worked for a big United Tobacco Company, one of the biggest tobacco companies in South Africa at that time. They used to make cigarettes, and he was in the advertising department. He used to organize, in those days they used to what they call window dress. They used to visit different stores, and they used to dress the windows for these stores in the products that they produced at the United Tobacco Company. And he was there for a number of years until he retired.
Yeah. Tell me about your mom. Was she a stay-at-home mom, or?
My mother was a very go-ahead woman, lady. She stayed at home for a while, but then eventually my father, he bought a small news agency business, a tobacconist, hairdressing saloon, and a newspaper agency, also in the Gardens. And he carried on working for the United Tobacco Company, and my mother ran the business. And they were there for a number of years, and we stayed upstairs. They had the apartments upstairs, and we had an apartment upstairs. As a matter of fact, I still remember the name. It was called Cameron Flats. And eventually, we moved from there, also in the Gardens, to a place called Forey Street. That was about half a mile away from where my father bought the shop. As I said, my father still carried on working for the United Tobacco Company, and my mother ran the store. Eventually, they bought another shop downtown in Cape Town, in St. George's Street, the same type of shop, a tobacconist and all that. And while my mother ran the shop in the Gardens, we got another lady to run the shop in downtown Cape Town in St. George's Street. So they had the two shops, and my father was still working for the tobacco company. Eventually, we sold the shop. They sold the shop downtown, and they decided to move away from where we stayed to a place called Muizenberg. That was one of the holiday resorts, approximately 16 miles from Cape Town. So my father sold the other shop, and we moved to Muizenberg. That was, I think, before the war. Before the war started in 1939.
When you and your sister, was it hard on you guys to change schools and make new friends when the family would be moving around?
Well, the thing was, we didn't change schools, because when I was in the Gardens, I went to school, but I was already grown up. I'd finished school when we left the Gardens to go to Muizenberg.
Okay.
My sister also, she was 5 years younger than me, and she went to school also.
What did you do for fun when you were little?
What did I do for fun?
Yeah.
Well, we didn't do very much for fun in those days. We weren't very well off. So I didn't do very much for fun.
Yeah. Well, did you ever do something that you knew you just didn't want your parents to know you were doing it?
I went to a very good school in Cape Town. It was called the Sachs. It was one of the premier schools in Cape Town. That was Sachs, and then there was Dyson College and Weinberg Preparatory School. Those were the prime schools in Cape Town. Well, when we moved to Muizenberg, I had already finished school. I finished what they call, well, here you call them a grade 12. There we went up to grade 10, and that we called a matric. We called it matric there. And then I didn't go to college. Firstly, I don't think I had the knowledge to go to college in those days. I wasn't clever. I just managed to get through.
You remember your grandparents at all?
No.
No knowledge of them?
Not at all.
You know what they did for a living or anything?
I never met them. I didn't know where they stayed. All I know is that they stayed in England. And seeing that my parents came from England, I never had the privilege of meeting any of my grandparents at all. I didn't know who they were, what they looked like, or anything.
Did your parents ever tell you why they left England?
No, they didn't tell me. Well, you know, firstly, I'll tell you, my mother came from a place called Golders Green. And then my father came from the East End of London. Now, the East End of London in those days was where all the Cockney stayed. And they weren't very well off. You know, that's a very poor area, the East End of London. And I presume that things were a bit hard there. So they decided to move to Cape Town, to South Africa. But when they moved, they weren't married. They didn't know each other.
Oh, wow.
They met in Cape Town and they got married in Cape Town.
Did they ever go back?
Oh, yes. My mother went back a number of times, and my father didn't go back he didn't go back, but my mother went back a couple of times because she had siblings there. And she also had parents there, and that's why she went back.
Did she ever tell you about stories or anything about those trips?
No, she never told me anything about my parents at all, about my grandparents. I knew very little about them at all.
How did World War I affect your family?
Well, firstly, my mother had a brother who was killed in World War I. And that's all the recollection I had of what they knew about World War I. That's all.
Yeah.
But I know that my mother had a brother and he was killed in World War I. Because my mother came from a sibling of 5. So I know that she definitely had a brother that was killed in World War I. And that's, well, I was still young at the time. I was just not even a year old, you know what I mean. Born in 1917, the war finished in 1918, so I must have been a year old. But I knew nothing. They knew nothing about the war except that my mother's brother got killed. That's all.
Right. Now, after school, you went on to work. Where did you go to work after you finished school?
I went to work for an accounting firm in Cape Town. I wasn't articled, you know, in South Africa. If you want to be an accountant, you've got to be articled, as my son was. So I just worked there for a while, and I worked until the war started.
Now, when the war started and you're in South Africa, what kind of news are you getting? What are you guys knowing about the war? How are you hearing about it?
Well, the thing was that we heard very little about the war. Except that, as you know, that South Africa at that time was a part of the British Commonwealth, as was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India. And when Britain in 1939 declared war on Germany, South Africa, as I said, being part of the British Commonwealth, declared war as well. And that was the first time that we heard about the war.
Right.
And that's it. And then I felt a bit guilty about not going to war. But the thing was that in South Africa, not like America, in America, if there's a war on, they have what they call a draft system. They draft you into the army. At that time in South Africa, you had to volunteer. So all the South African people who were in the war were all volunteers. They were all volunteers to go to fight. And, you know, both my parents came from England, and I thought, well, it would be my duty also to join up. So I went and I registered, and I joined the army.
What did your parents think about that?
Well, of course, my mother was against it because, you know, being a mother, you know, she thought of the consequences of going to war and getting killed and all that, and she wasn't happy about it at all. That I can tell you that now. My father didn't mind, but she wasn't happy about it at all.
So you join up. Where are you being sent?
Right. Now, as you know, the war started in 1939. I joined up the beginning of January 1940. And I went to a place called Roberts Heights. That is about just outside Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa. And that was the Air Force headquarters. And I went there as a civilian, and I registered, and I said I want to join the South African Air Force as an air gunner. So they accepted my application, and then I was given a uniform, and I was told to report back to Cape Town. And I went back to Cape Town to the headquarters at the castle. There was a big castle in Cape Town, and from there I was drafted to a city called Bloemfontein. Now Bloemfontein was a big city in what we call the Orange Free State. Here you call them states. That was a province. We call them provinces, and that was the Orange Free State, Bloemfontein. While I was at Bloemfontein, I learned the Morse code. I did wireless work, etc., etc. I learned all about wirelesses and Morse code and that. When I finished that course, that lasted a number of months, I was drafted back to Cape Town, where I did a gunnery course. You learn all about the guns that they use, the rifles and guns they use in the war. And I did quite a lot of practice flying, what they called a drogue, like it was a thing. They pulled it along with a plane, and you sat in another plane, and you shot at that drogue. You see, like you're shooting at an enemy aircraft. That lasted a couple of months. That lasted a couple of months. From there, I was sent back to Pretoria, and I was sent to a place called Littleton. Now, Littleton was the base for registering all air crews who were joining the South African Air Force. That contained pilots, navigators, air gunners. And they interviewed you there, and they asked you different questions about joining, why you want to join the Air Force, and they did some training there as well. When I finished that, I was transferred back to, as I say, to Roberts Heights. That was the headquarters of the Air Force outside Pretoria. And I was there, and they said to me that, okay, you're now qualified as an air gunner. You are now a sergeant. So they gave me 3 stripes, and I had an Air Force wing called AG, which was air gunner. And my mother was very unhappy about that when she saw me with this AG. And so then they said, okay, you're going back. You're going up to the war zone in the Middle East. So from there, we went to Durban. That's a town on the east coast of South Africa. From Durban, we went to another place called Mombasa. Now, Mombasa is a city in Kenya, and that's where we took we took a train ride from Kenya, from Mombasa on the east coast of Africa to Nairobi.
Did you have any information what was going on in the war at this time? Or
Yes, I did have. We had information that there was fierce fighting in the Western Desert, and that the Germans were pushing them, were pushing the army back. They were going backwards and forwards. Once they were here, then they pushed them back, then they pushed them back again. We knew all that. And then we went to Nairobi. At that time, they needed Air Force personnel and air crews immediately. So we went to a place called Nairobi in Kenya. We stayed there for a day or so. From Kenya, from Nairobi, we went to a place called Nanyuki. That was a small little town outside Nairobi. And you get there by train, it's in the mountain. You get there, it's in the mountains. You get there by train, it takes 5, 6, 7, 8 hours to get there because the train is climbing all the time. At Nanyuki was a station for crewing up, where air gunners and pilots and navigators get together and they crew you up. Now, you go there for training, for operational training. So I got crewed up for the pilot, a navigator, an observer, that's the one, and another air gunner. And we did practice flying in a plane called a Blenheim. That was a very old plane which they used at the beginning of the war, England, and then they stopped using Blenheims and they used it for practice purposes. Now there was a big problem with me because I had a pilot and a crew, and one night we were supposed to go on a training flight at night. We did a lot of night flying at night, and unfortunately I got the flu. And I had a very high temperature, and they wouldn't let me fly that night. So they put somebody else in my place. And I think God must have been with me that night, because the plane crashed into the mountains. As I said, this Nanyuki was in the mountains. And they crashed and they all got killed. So I was left at this operational training unit by myself without a crew.
What went through your mind when that happened?
Well, you know that, I thought, well, as I said, somebody up there must like me. So that's what happened. That's what went through my mind. How lucky I was that I didn't go. At the same time, I was ill with the flu, had a high temperature, and that was it. That happened. Of course, I was very upset about it, but eventually I was on my own. I had no crew, nothing. So what happened was they decided that they've got a number of crews. They had about 10 or 12 crews ready for operational training, and me. And then I was sent. We were all sent by air to Egypt, to Cairo. And we were based at a place called Al Marza. That was about 10 or 12 miles outside of Cairo. That was our base camp. That's where where the whole squadron was. As I must tell you, there were 3 squadrons attached to what they call one South African wing. The whole wing was only South Africans. It was number 12 squadron, number 24 squadron, and number 21 squadron. They were attached to what they called a 3-wing. And eventually, when I landed on this Al Marza base, I didn't have a crew, so we were all posted to the forward base. You know, you get the base camp, then you get a forward base, and from the forward base, you do your operational flying unit. The operational base was outside Alexandria in Egypt. Eventually, I was called in, and they said, "Look, Sergeant, there's a captain coming to the squadron, and you'll get crewed up with him. We have an observer, navigator, and another air gunner, and that will be your crew." Eventually, my pilot arrived, and we got crewed up. And at that time, we started doing operational flying. At that time, Rommel was pushing the 8th Army right back from Benghazi to Brook, Libya. They were pushing them back, and then the 8th Army would push them all back again. So we did a lot of flying, and we did a lot of night flying, and we did a lot of bombing of harbors, Tobruk and Derna, where the Germans were getting all their supplies for the desert campaign.
Did you ever have a scary moment out there?
Well, I had a lot of scary moments, but a bit later on during my flying campaign. At that time, when Rommel, as we did a lot of flying to try and relieve the pressure on Rommel pushing forward. At that time, Rommel pushed the 8th Army to a place called El Alamein. I don't know if you've heard El Alamein. El Alamein at that time was a British stronghold, and eventually they had a general there, and then eventually they sent General Bernard Montgomery. General Bernard Montgomery was a general. Now, General Montgomery, in my humble opinion, was the finest general who ever led the Allied army against the Germans. He started the campaign against the Germans. And it happened at night when he started a barrage of cannons against the Germans. And at that time, at night, we started doing a lot of night flying to follow up on his bombardment of the Germans in the desert. And this carried on for a few days, a day and night flying, and eventually we started pushing the Germans further back. As they pushed them further back, so we started bombing them. At that time, Montgomery started full force, the tanks and everything, the Air Force, all involved in getting the Germans back. Eventually, as we pushed them back, we were operating bombing and things like that. Eventually, we managed to push them right back at Benghazi. You've heard about Benghazi in Libya, and Derna, and Tobruk, and eventually we pushed them right into Benghazi in Libya, and we continued all the bombings, operations, etc., etc. And at that time, as you know, the Americans were coming in from the north, and the 8th Army was coming in from the south, and Rommel was in the middle. Now, Rommel, in my humble opinion, was also one of the greatest generals. Although he was a German, Rommel was a shrewd, very shrewd operator, and I think that if they ever replaced Rommel, that was one of the biggest mistakes they made, to replace Rommel in the Western Desert, because after he left, that's when the Germans fell apart, and then after that we finished pushing them out of Africa, and that was my first tour of operations, and that was before the next part of the tour. I was still had the same crew. The next part of the operations was to invade Libya. Well, I wasn't a part of that because I already finished my first tour of operations, and I managed to get some what you call furlough or leave, and I managed to get a flight back to South Africa.
How many missions had you flown already?
62.
62?
Yeah, but they were short missions, hour and a half, 2 hours. They weren't like that you take in the Americans flew over Germany, 5-6 hour trips like that, you know what I mean? Yeah. These were short trips, hour and a half, 2 hours. And some of them a bit longer. But anyway, after I finished the 62, I managed to I came back to South Africa. And I had a what you call furlough or leave. And after that, I went back to Pretoria again, and I was sent on a refresher course to a place called Oudtshoorn that was also in the Cape. And while I was at Oudtshoorn, I was the only experienced air gunner there. I did a little bit of instructing, which they asked me to do. And after that, I got tired of being instructor and doing nothing. I was sent back to Pretoria. And when I got back to Pretoria, I thought, well, I'll see what's going to happen now. Perhaps they may send me to Cape Town as an instructor or something like that. So they said, no, you're going back to the Middle East. So I was sent back to Cairo, and I went to the Al Mazrah base, as I told you, and they sent for me. And they said, I was there a flight sergeant. I got promoted. You get a sergeant, a flight sergeant. You get the extra. Yeah.
Right.
So they said to me, we're sending you to a place called Gibraltar. I said, what? They're sending you to a Gibraltar. We had a squadron on Gibraltar, 22 squadron, and we had a colonel there by the name of Colonel Nash. And we had there's a crew there by Major Woods. We used to call him Planky Woods. You're going to join his crew in Gibraltar. So I wasn't happy about that because I wasn't happy about the planes that they were flying in. They were flying in a plane called Ventura, and they had a lot of problems and crashes with these Venturas. I wasn't happy about it, but you can't argue with them, so I went back to Gibraltar. And at Gibraltar, I joined this crew, and we did a lot of reconnaissance work, escorting ships and convoys through the Straits of Gibraltar, and also looking for submarines. And we did this for a number of months until the war ended. At that time, the South African squadron was number 22 squadron, and we were attached to a Royal Air Force squadron. The Royal Air Force squadron was based in Gibraltar, a permanent, and we joined this and we joined them, and we did all their operational training there. Now you must understand that after all, I was used to flying 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours flights doing bombing. There, you had to do 6, 7, 8 hours flying because, the escort, you fly out into the sea, then you escort the ships right through the Straits of Gibraltar, escorting the Americans through, looking for submarines and all that. So you got a 6 to 7, 8 hour flights. So that's what I did. And I joined this RAF squadron. And it was funny, but they said, at that time, I forgot to tell you, when I got back to South Africa after my first tour of operations, I was promoted from a flight sergeant to a second lieutenant. That's what they call it, pips. Yeah, they give you one pip. I was now a second lieutenant. And then I was sent back to and I went to Gibraltar. And at Gibraltar, I got promoted again to a full lieutenant. That was 2 pips. And at that time, that when you're an officer attached to the Royal Air Force, you get what you call a batman. A batman is a guy who looks after your clothes, your food, makes your bed, all that. I wasn't used to having a batman. It's like a servant. And eventually we did all this. We did a lot of flying in Gibraltar. Escorting ships looking for submarines and taking supplies to North Africa, Morocco, all around there. And we used to get our supplies from Casablanca, and we used to send the plane over, fill it up and bring it back, and backwards and forwards, also in Morocco. And that's where I stayed until 1945 when the war ended.
Tell me a scary moment.
My scary moment was when I was doing operational training using Union in the desert, doing operational training in my first tour. It happened. We did a night operational sortie, and what happened was that we were flying into land, and one of the German bombers they found our air landing strip, and they were coming in this way. So they were bombing this way, and we were flying right into the bombs. So if it hadn't been for my pilot, who was a very experienced pilot, we managed to pull up and get out of the problems. That was the biggest scare I had.
And what happened to the German plane?
Well, they went on.
It just went on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a very scary, it was, that was due to the pilot's quickness in pulling back and
Right.
like that. That was it.
When the war ended, were you relieved? Were you?
Yes, I was. Because to tell you the truth, that I had a lot of flying in Gibraltar, and it was 6, 7, 8 hours at a time, and I felt that I had enough now. I had enough flying and things like that. And when the war ended, we were all happy in Gibraltar. Eventually, what happened was we had to take all the planes from Gibraltar back to Egypt, and we went to a place called Gibraltar. That was outside Alexandria, and that's where we stayed with all the planes there. The war had stopped already, and that's where we stayed until we were sent back to South Africa to be released from the army. And I remember that in February 1946. 1946. That was in February 1946. That's when I was sent back to South Africa.
And so now, what do you do?
And then I got demobilized.
And where do you go on with your life? Did you get a job? What did
Yes,
you do?
I got a job. I wasn't settled. My mind wasn't settled. Look, let me tell you something. I was, flying under stress when you've got anti-aircraft coming up. You've got those because the Germans had what they called an 88 gun, and that was a very, very accurate gun, and it shot down a number of planes. And also you had the night fighters and the day fighters, you know what I mean? Now, I must tell you this, that during the operations on the desert, we had what we called, each squadron had 18 planes flying at the same time. 18. They had boxes of 6, 3, 3, 6. And of course, when you get 18 aircraft flying during the day, you're sitting ducks with these 88 guns. And of course, that plays on your nerve. Look, I can't tell you that I wasn't nervous. Of course I was nervous, about flying, taking off, and you're seeing planes crash. One night we were taking off, and the plane that took off before us crashed into another plane, and if we would have taken off, we would also crash into that plane. So I wasn't settled during the war, and I had a number of jobs which eventually I was making a living, and then that's when I got married in 1942.
Well,
1947.
Where did you meet Rose?
Well, Rose, my wife, yeah. My wife Rose was born in Lithuania, and she came to South Africa with her siblings and her parents. There were 7 of them, and they settled in Cape Town, and eventually they bought a business about 30 miles outside Cape Town at a place called Paarl, one of the small little towns outside Paarl. You get these small towns in America here. And they had a business there. And Rose used to go. Rose was young then, and she went to school at La Rochelle, one of the big schools in girls' school in Paarl. Eventually, they sold the business, and they moved to where we stayed in Muizenberg. That was 1946. That's after the war. After I was in Muizenberg, and they came to settle there in Muizenberg, and so I saw this beautiful woman. She was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and she was something special. She had a number of people, a number of guys looking after her. The one guy had a furniture factory. The one boy had a clothing factory. this guy had that, and they were all moneyed at that time, and they were all interested in Rose. And I was a poor working guy. Eventually, we met each other at the sports club. We had a sports club in Muizenberg, in the hall, where we played badminton and all that kind of stuff. And that's where we met. And we fell in love. And we got married in June 1947. 1947, that's when we got married. And Rose was a very go-ahead woman. She wasn't prepared to sit at home and do nothing. At that time, I was working, and at that time, we bought a small grocery store in a place called Weinberg, and we managed the store. Eventually, we had to give up the store. My landlord wanted the shop, etc., etc., and Rose took a job at a very big firm called Edgar's. She was into the knowledge of women's clothing, and she knew all about women's clothing, and she was given a job in one of these stores, Edgar's stores. At that time, after we sold the shop, I had a phone call from a gentleman by the name of Jack Golden. Jack Golden was, may he rest in peace, he's dead now. He had a small grocery store in a place called Claremont. And he was a very go-ahead guy. And he was looking forward to opening up a chain of supermarkets in South Africa. And he needed a manager to run his store, which he had in Belvedere Road, called Suburban Provision Stores. And he called me, he said, I hear that you're closing your store, I want you to come and see me. So I went to see him, and he said, look, I'd like to go to America to get some idea about opening up a chain of supermarket stores here. So he came to America, and he got a lot of ideas about supermarketing. He went to Switzerland, and there's a big chain, Karoo or Canoe, whatever, I can't remember the name. And he got ideas, and he came back to South Africa, and we together opened up a chain of stores, which today is called Pick n Pay, which is one of the biggest supermarkets in Africa today. And at that time, we opened up 4 stores, and I was the manager of one. I was the manager of the Belvedere store. I was the first manager of Pick n Pay at that store, and we opened up 3 other stores, one in a place called Salary Road, and the Belvedere, and the Bergfleet, and Lansdowne Road. So we had the 4 stores, and we each had managers, and eventually there was another supermarket chain called Checkers, which was run by a very prominent businessman called Raymond Ackerman. He started Checkers, and he built it up into a big business. And eventually, this is very interesting, the story, Checkers was taken over by a firm called Greatermans. Now, Raymond Ackerman's father was also a very big businessman. He opened up an haberdashery business called Ackermans, and it grew into a very big chain, and Greatermans took over Ackermans. And when Raymond Ackerman's father died, they fired Raymond Ackerman after he'd opened up all these Checkers stores. And that was the worst thing they ever did, because Raymond Ackerman approached his brother-in-law that he was looking for a small supermarket chain where he could buy and build up. And eventually they found this Pick n Pay business, and he bought Pick n Pay business. That was, I think, about 1960, somewhere in 1960, 61, 62. And I remained on, and I kept on. I still was managing Belvedere Road. And then after we had 5 stores, he went on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and we were each given a number of shares. Like, you got the Wall Street here, was the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And then I went to different stores, and I went to a store in Bergfleet and Lansdowne Road, and Sea Point, which was a big seaside resort in Cape Town, in Sea Point. And I went there, and from there I was transferred back to Lansdowne Road, which was the biggest store, which was our biggest store, and things weren't running too well there, and he wanted me to take over there. So I took over Lansdowne Road, and eventually, after that, I was sent up. They called me back to headquarters. This is very distinct in my mind. He said, "Look, we want you to go to Sea Point. We've got problems in Sea Point, and they need a very man with experience. We want you to go there." So I went there, and I had to reorganize the whole store. And eventually, everything was fine. Now, this is a typical story of my capabilities. I must exaggerate it. One day, a lady came into the store, and she filled up these carts with stuff, and she found out that she left her purse at home. So she came to me and she said, "Look, I've got all this stuff, but I haven't got a purse. I'm waiting for my husband to come. I've called him. He'll be here later on." So I said, "Well, that's no problem. You get all this packed up and take it home with you. If you haven't got a ride, I'll take you home with all your stuff. And when your husband comes, you can come back and pay me." She says, "Will you do that?" I said, "Sure." So I did that. Eventually, her husband came, and of course she paid. The next day I got a letter from Raymond Ackerman. This woman had written to him to tell him that the best thing he ever did was to put Alec Jonas, a manager of Sea Point, because a thorough gentleman, a man who no doubt had knowledge of what he was doing. And that remained in my mind for a long time. And I was there for 26 years. 1985, I was getting chest pains. And I went to a cardiologist called Dr. Maben, and he said, "You've got 3 blockages. You have to have an operation." Now, if you remember correctly, that we had a Professor Chris Barnard. Chris Barnard was the first man in the world to do a heart transplant, and he did it at Grootsky Hospital in Cape Town. And the second surgeon was a guy by the name of Joe de Nobrega. And I went to see Joe de Nobrega, and he said, yes, he said, "I can do the operation." And I had the operation done in 1985. Beginning of 1985, 96, I think it was. And in 1986, after I worked again, I felt now that I was still working. And then in 1986, in 1984, while I was still working, they came to America. Him and Veronique, his wife, and the 3 children. They were all born in America, in South Africa. They came, and then that's in 1982. That's when they came. And then they came to settle here, and I came to visit them. My wife and myself came to visit them. Eventually, my other son, his brother, who stays in California, he came in 1984. And he also settled here, and he settled in Washington, D.C., where he worked in the hospital, and then he specialized in California. In 1986, my late wife was, decided that, seeing that the 2 boys are in America, and Hilton had 3 grandchildren, we decided to come and settle in America in 1986.
Let me ask you, why did your sons decide they wanted to come to America?
I don't think that both of them, well, I know he wasn't I don't think he was happy with the situation in South Africa at that time under the apartheid government, and I don't think they could see any future. So they decided to come.
The Great Depression that America was going through when you were real young, did that affect your family at all in South
I
Africa?
didn't, to tell you the truth, I didn't know about the Depression. I only heard about it when I came to America. I didn't know anything about the Depression. I don't think it affected my family at all.
Okay. Now, when you came to America, what was that like?
Well, you know, it's a funny question, but when we came to South Africa, we came to America in 1986, and we settled in Dallas. Of course, we did visit a few things. We went to New York. We stayed at the Hilton on 6th Avenue. We went to Las Vegas, and then San Francisco, and then we came to settle in Dallas. So we didn't know what to expect, but we knew that we were coming to a country which was which we felt was number one in the finance world, number one in the military world, and right on top. And so that's what we thought. We were coming to America, and we were right. I know that when they came, I know that Dallas was on a boom, and the Cowboys were God's team. I think Roger Staubach was the Staubach, and that's why they came to settle in Dallas, you see. But I know that Hilton and his partners, there were 4 of them, came to America before they settled here. And Hilton worked for a gentleman by the name of Mr. Rosenblum, and they came to America with Mr. Rosenblum's family. And I think when they came to America, they decided that Hilton and Lawrence, one of Mr. Rosenblum's sons, decided to settle in Dallas. And that's what they did.
Alex, what was the happiest time in your life?
My happy family life.